Judge William Harrison's alarm buzzed at exactly 6:30 a.m., just as it had for the past 20 years. He reached over and turned it off with the practiced motion of someone who lived by routine. The early morning sunlight was beginning to peek through the expensive curtains of his Highland Park home, casting long shadows across his bedroom. At 62 years old, Judge Harrison took pride in maintaining the same schedule he had followed since his appointment to the Dallas County Courthouse. His wife, Margaret, was already downstairs preparing his usual breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and black coffee. The smell wafted up to the second floor as he adjusted his bow tie in the mirror, looking sharp as always. "Dear," Margaret called out as he descended the stairs in his pressed black robe. She was a small woman with gray hair and a permanent smile, which she had worn for the past 30 years while supporting her husband's career. "Big day ahead?" "Just the usual," Harrison replied, settling into his chair at the breakfast table. He opened the Dallas Morning News, scanning the headlines while taking small bites of his toast. "Traffic court this morning, minor infractions in the afternoon. Nothing I haven't seen thousands of times before." The judge prided himself on running an efficient courtroom. His colleagues often joked that you could set your watch by Judge Harrison's proceedings. He moved through cases quickly, rarely letting defendants ramble on with excuses. In his mind, this was the mark of a good judge, swift to administer justice. As he drove his Mercedes to the courthouse, Harrison noticed that the city was already bustling. Construction workers were beginning their day, shop owners were lifting their shutters, and students waited at bus stops. He barely registered the diversity of faces he passed, having grown comfortable in his own world of legal procedures and courthouse politics. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when he arrived at 8:15 a.m., just as he liked it. Harrison nodded to the security guard, Tom, who had been working the morning shift for as long as he could remember. "Morning, Judge," Tom said with a friendly wave, not bothering to check his ID badge anymore. In his chambers, Harrison's clerk, Jessica, had already arranged the day's files into neat stacks on his desk. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, handing him his schedule. "We have 37 cases this morning in traffic court. The first one is at 9 a.m. sharp." Harrison skimmed through the files quickly. Most were speeding tickets, parking violations, or running red lights, cases he had seen thousands of times over the years. He had developed a system. Young people usually got stern warnings, middle-aged folks got standard fines, and he tended to be more lenient with elderly defendants who seemed confused by traffic rules. What Harrison never admitted to himself was how his quick judgments often carried unconscious biases. He didn't notice how his stern warnings were more often given to young white defendants, while similar cases involving minorities usually resulted in fines. In his mind, he was simply being efficient, making snap decisions based on his decades of experience. At 8:55 a.m., Harrison straightened his robe and prepared to enter the courtroom. He could hear the murmur of voices through the door, defendants, lawyers, and court officers all getting ready for another day of justice being served. Jessica handed him his gavel, and he took a moment to straighten the family photos on his desk: his 3 grown children, all successful professionals, and his 4 grandchildren, all smiles. His voice boomed through the courtroom as Harrison entered at exactly 9 a.m. The familiar words washed over him as he took his seat at the bench, looking out over the gathered crowd. The faces before him were diverse, young and old, different races and backgrounds, but Harrison saw them all the same way: cases to be processed, decisions to be made, justice to be served. Little did Judge William Harrison know, this ordinary Tuesday would turn out to be anything but routine. As he settled into his chair and prepared to call the first case, he had no idea that one of today's cases would force him to confront truths about himself that he had spent decades ignoring. The morning proceeded as usual in Judge Harrison's courtroom. He moved through cases quickly, hardly looking up from his papers as he handed out fines and warnings. By 10:45 a.m., he had already processed 23 cases, most ending with guilty pleas and standard fines. Case number 2487, Sarah Mitchell, the bailiff called. A well-dressed black woman in her mid-30s stood up from the middle row. She walked forward with quiet confidence, her shoulders straight and head held high. Her dark blue business suit was perfectly pressed, and her natural hair was styled professionally. In her hand, she carried a leather portfolio filled with documents. Several other defendants, waiting their turn, watched with interest. Sarah Mitchell didn't look like the usual nervous people who appeared before Judge Harrison. There was something different about her presence, a calm assurance that seemed out of place in traffic court. "Miss Mitchell," Judge Harrison began, finally glancing up from his papers. "You're here contesting a parking violation from March 15th. The fine is $250. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied clearly, her voice steady and well-educated. "I have documentation that proves I had permission to park in that space." Judge Harrison sighed heavily, making no attempt to hide his irritation. Another person trying to waste the court's time with excuses, he thought to himself. He had seen it all before, or so he believed. "Miss Mitchell, the officer's report clearly states your vehicle was parked in a restricted zone outside the state office building for over 3 hours, he said, his tone becoming increasingly condescending. "These spaces are reserved for official business only." Sarah opened her portfolio and removed several papers. "Yes, Your Honor, if I may explain?" The judge interrupted, barely glancing at the documents she was trying to present. "Are you saying you couldn't understand the parking signs?" A slight murmur ran through the courtroom. Several observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the judge's dismissive tone and underlying assumptions. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "Actually, Your Honor," she began again, "I was there on official." Harrison cut her off again, his patience wearing thin. "This court sees dozens of these cases every week. Everyone has an excuse. Everyone was just running in for a minute, or didn't see the sign. The fact is, you parked illegally in a restricted zone." Sarah stood quietly, watching as the judge shuffled through his papers without really looking at her evidence. She noticed a young clerk in the corner of the courtroom taking notes, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, "given the length of time your vehicle was parked there, I'm going to increase the fine to $500 to ensure the message is properly received. Perhaps that will help you pay more attention to parking restrictions in the future." The courtroom had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual whispers and shuffling had ceased. The bailiff, who had worked with Judge Harrison for years, was watching the scene with growing unease. Sarah took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "if you would just look at my documentation." Judge Harrison's voice grew sharp. "This is not a debate. The fine is $500. If you cannot pay the full amount, you can speak with the clerk about a payment plan." He reached for his gavel, ready to move on to the next case. "Actually, Your Honor," Sarah spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "I believe you'll find this documentation quite relevant." "You see, Miss Mitchell," Harrison's voice rose, "I've made my ruling. Unless you want to be held in contempt of court, I suggest you accept the fine and move along. We have other cases to handle today." Sarah didn't move. Instead, she calmly placed her business card on the evidence table. The young clerk leaned forward to get a better look, her eyes widening. The bailiff, curious about the unusual tension in the room, stepped closer to read the card. No one in the courtroom, least of all Judge Harrison, was prepared for what Sarah Mitchell was about to say next. The routine traffic court session was about to become anything but routine, and Judge Harrison's comfortable world was moments away from being turned upside down. The young clerk's gasp was barely audible, but it caught the attention of several people in the courtroom. Judge Harrison, however, remained focused on asserting his authority, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere around him. "Your Honor," Sarah began again, her voice steady despite the clear dismissal she had faced, "as my documentation shows." Harrison interrupted once more, his voice cracking with irritation. "I have heard quite enough. This is not a discussion. The fine stands at $500, and I'm adding a $50 court fee for wasting valuable time." He reached for his gavel, ready to finish the case. But Sarah didn't back down. "In fact," she said, "that's it." Harrison slammed his gavel down one more time. "One more word from you, and I'll hold you in contempt." The fine is now $600, due within 30 days. Bailiff, please escort Miss Mitchell to the clerk's office. The bailiff hesitated, his eyes moving between the judge and Sarah's business card still lying on the evidence table. The young clerk had gone pale, and the reporter was now standing, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Sarah stood her ground, unflinching. She reached into her portfolio and pulled out another document, placing it carefully next to her business card. The court officer nearest the table took one look at it and stepped back, his eyes widening. Judge Harrison, still red-faced and angry, was the only person in the room who hadn't yet realized that his comfortable world was about to shatter. He reached for his gavel one more time, ready to assert his authority once and for all. What happened next would make headlines across the state and change the Dallas County Courthouse forever. Sarah Mitchell was about to speak, and everyone in the courtroom, except Judge Harrison, knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. Your Honor, Sarah's voice cut through the tension, sharp as a bell ringing in church. I am Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Senior Policy Advisor to the State Governor on Judicial Reform. She paused, letting her words hang in the air, sinking in. I was parked in my designated space, conducting an official review of this court's proceedings. The G and Judge Harrison's raised hand froze midair. His face, flushed with anger moments earlier, now drained of all color. The document on the evidence table was her state government credentials, complete with the governor's seal. I've been observing county courts across the state for the past 3 months, Sarah continued, her voice calm. Today's interaction will be part of my official report on discriminatory patterns within our judicial system. The courtroom erupted into a chorus of hushed whispers. The reporter was filming on his phone, capturing every moment of Judge Harrison's visible unease. The young clerk, who had been pretending to write, now stared, mouth agape, at the unfolding scene. I apologize, Dr. Mitchell, Judge Harrison stammered, suddenly straightening his robe. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. If you had only explained. I tried to explain several times, Your Honor, Sarah responded evenly. But you seemed more interested in lecturing me on pictographs and my ability to understand simple parking signs. Several people in the gallery nodded in agreement. The elderly black woman at the back of the room now smiled, watching as a different kind of justice was served. My team has been gathering data on fine distributions, sentencing patterns, and judicial conduct across various demographics, Sarah continued, opening her portfolio. Would you be interested in seeing our preliminary findings for your courtroom, Judge Harrison? Judge Harrison's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. Dr. Mitchell, perhaps we should discuss this in my chambers, he said, his voice cracking. Sarah interrupted firmly. Since your comments and rulings were made in open court, this discussion should remain in open court as well. She pulled out a stack of papers. For example, in the last 6 months, defendants of color in your courtroom were 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines compared to white defendants with identical violations. The reporter's pen moved furiously across his notepad. 2 more journalists had slipped into the courtroom, having heard the commotion. Furthermore, Sarah continued, her voice steady, your interruption rate for defendants of color is 85% higher than for white defendants. And your use of condescending language, such as explaining pictograms and suggesting payment plans without being asked, shows a clear pattern of bias. Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The BFF moved closer to Sarah, not to escort her out, but to protect her. Your Honor, Sarah said, softening her tone slightly, I am not here to embarrass you. I am part of a larger initiative to identify and address systemic biases in our judicial system. Your courtroom is not unique in showing these patterns, but today's interaction provided a particularly clear example. The judge appeared to age 10 years in those few minutes. His hands gripped the edge of his bench as he struggled to maintain composure. My assigned parking space, Sarah added, pulling out one last document, is clearly marked with my name and title. The same space you accused me of illegally occupying. Would you like to review that documentation now? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every eye was fixed on Judge Harrison, waiting for his response. The world of comfortable assumptions and unchecked authority that he had lived in had just shattered, and in the most public way imaginable. "Dr. Mitchell," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I sincerely apologize for my behavior. The fine is dismissed, and I would be grateful for the opportunity to review your findings in detail." Sarah nodded as she gathered her documents. "Thank you, Your Honor. You'll be receiving a full copy of our report next week. I trust you'll find it enlightening." She turned to leave, but paused. "Oh, and Judge Harrison, those pictograms you mentioned, they work quite well when people actually take the time to read them." As she walked out of the courtroom, the sound of her heels clicking softly on the floor, everyone knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. But this was only the beginning of what would become a much bigger story. For several long moments after Dr. Mitchell left, the courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Judge Harrison sat motionless on his bench, face pale, hands still gripping the edge of his desk. The sound of the closing door seemed to echo like a final gong. "Court is in recess for 30 minutes, he announced at last, his voice cracking. Without waiting for the BFF's usual announcement, he stood abruptly and hurried toward his chambers. His normally straight shoulders were now hunched, making his black robe seem 2 sizes too big. Outside in the courthouse hallway, the scene was anything but quiet. News traveled fast in the Dallas County Courthouse, and within minutes, people emerged from other courtrooms to hear what had happened. The journalists who had witnessed the event were already calling their editors, speaking in excited whispers. "You should have seen his face when she revealed who she was," one reporter said into his phone. "This isn't just a local story anymore. We're talking about the governor's office directly catching a judge in a discriminatory act." Inside his chambers, Judge Harrison loosened his bow tie with trembling fingers. Jessica, his clerk, stood uncertainly in the doorway, holding a stack of papers she had been asked to file earlier. "Cancel the rest of today's docket," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Reschedule everything." He paused and added, "And get me the case files for the last 6 months. All of them." Meanwhile, in the courthouse lobby, the elderly black woman who had witnessed everything approached Dr. Mitchell, who was making notes in her portfolio. "Thank you," the woman said simply, eyes glistening with tears. "I've been coming to this courthouse for 40 years. Never thought I'd see anything like that." Sarah smiled warmly and squeezed the woman's hand. "This is just the beginning," she reassured her. "We're looking at every county courthouse in the state." By now, the courthouse security guards were dealing with an unusual influx of people. Local news stations had somehow gotten word, and reporters were starting to gather outside. Through the glass doors, camera crews could be seen setting up their equipment. Back in the courtroom, the young clerk gathered her things, hands shaking slightly. She had been taking notes all morning as usual, but now she looked at her notebook differently. All those times she had felt uneasy with the judge's tone or decisions but said nothing. Now, they were all there in black and white. Judge Harrison's BFF stood alone in the empty courtroom, staring at the spot where Dr. Mitchell had stood. In his 20 years working with the judge, he had never seen anything like this. In the courthouse cafeteria, the morning's events were the only topic of conversation. Court officers, lawyers, and courthouse staff huddled around tables, speaking in hushed but excited tones. "I heard she's been collecting data for months," one public defender said. "Not just here, but all over the state." "My cousin works at the governor's office," another person chimed in. "Says Dr. Mitchell has a reputation for being thorough. When she finds something wrong, she doesn't just point it out. She fixes it." By noon, the story had reached local news websites. The first headlines began appearing. State policy advisor exposes judicial bias in real time, and Dallas judge caught in discriminatory act by governor's office. In his chambers, Judge Harrison looked at himself in the small mirror behind his door. His face was still pale, barely recognizable. The confident, authoritative man who had walked into court that morning was gone. In his place was a man seeing himself clearly for the first time in years. His phone rang constantly, calls from the media, colleagues, the county's chief judge. He let them all go to voicemail. Instead, he sat at his desk, pulled out a legal pad, and began to write. "Dear Dr. Mitchell," he started, then stopped. What could he say? How could he possibly explain or justify what had happened? As he struggled for the right words, he could hear the commotion outside his office. This was only the first hour after Dr. Mitchell's revelation. The real storm was beginning to gather, and Judge William Harrison's world would never be the same. By the next morning, the video of Judge Harrison's courtroom encounter with Dr. Mitchell had gone viral. Someone in the gallery had recorded the exchange on their phone, and now millions were watching as the judge's prejudice was exposed. Local news vans remained parked outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes reaching into the sky like metal trees. Reporters stood in front of their cameras, retelling the story that had captivated Dallas and beyond. Sources tell us Dr. Mitchell's investigation isn't limited to just traffic court, one reporter said. The governor's office is looking into every level of our judicial system, from minor infractions to major criminal cases. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtag Judge Harrison was trending alongside hashtag Dr. Mitchell and hashtag Courtroom Justice. People shared their own stories of facing discrimination in courtrooms across the country. Inside her office at the state capitol, Dr. Mitchell sat at her desk, reviewing hundreds of emails that had flooded her inbox. Many were from people who had appeared before Judge Harrison over the years, each sharing similar experiences of dismissive treatment and harsh fines. "We've received over 500 complaints just since yesterday," her assistant said, placing another stack of printed emails on her desk. "People aren't just talking about Judge Harrison anymore. They're coming forward about other judges, too." At home in Highland Park, Judge Harrison sat in his study, the morning newspaper spread before him. His wife, Margaret, stood in the doorway, worried. He hadn't touched his breakfast. "Maybe it's time to speak to the press," she suggested gently. "Tell your side of the story." But Harrison knew there was no side to tell. The video showed everything: his condescending tone, the repeated interruptions, the assumptions about Dr. Mitchell based on her race. The evidence was there for everyone to see. The story took another turn when Dr. Mitchell's office released a preliminary report. The data showed disturbing patterns in fine distributions across Dallas County. Black and Hispanic defendants were consistently charged higher fines than white defendants for the same violations. In Judge Harrison's courtroom alone, minorities paid an average of 40% more in fines for identical offenses over the past year. The courthouse steps became a gathering place for protesters. They carried signs reading "Justice should be colorblind" and "End courtroom bias." Local civil rights leaders organized rallies, demanding a complete review of all judges in the county. Television news shows invited legal experts to discuss the implications. "What makes this case so powerful," one commentator explained, "is that Dr. Mitchell didn't just tell us about the problem. She showed us. She let Judge Harrison reveal his own biases in real time." Several of Judge Harrison's colleagues began to distance themselves. Judges who had once joined him for lunch now avoided eye contact in the hallways. His regular golf partners suddenly had other commitments. The local association called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. The president of the association, a former prosecutor, addressed the press. "This isn't just about one judge or one courtroom," she said firmly. "This is about the integrity of our entire legal system. If people don't trust our courts to be fair, then the whole system fails." Online, the video continued to spread. Law professors used it in their classes as a teaching tool on judicial bias. Civil rights organizations added it to their training materials. Dr. Mitchell appeared on several national news programs, but she kept the focus on the bigger picture. "What happened in that courtroom was just a symptom," she explained calmly to one reporter. "The disease is systemic bias, and it exists in courtrooms across this country." By the end of the week, the governor's office announced an expansion of Dr. Mitchell's investigation to cover every county in the state. Other states began reaching out, seeking assistance to implement similar programs. The story had evolved far beyond one judge and one traffic ticket. It had become a national dialogue about justice, bias, and the urgent need for change in America's courts. Somewhere in Dallas, sitting in his home office with the blinds closed, Judge William Harrison began to understand that he had become more than just a man who made a mistake. He had become a symbol of everything that needed to change in the judicial system. 2 weeks after the courtroom incident, Judge William Harrison sat before the State Judicial Ethics Committee. The large hearing room was filled with observers, reporters, and legal professionals. Dr. Mitchell sat in the front row, her leather portfolio resting on her lap, watching in silence. The committee chairwoman began, her voice firm but not unkind. "We are here today to review your conduct and determine the appropriate actions moving forward. Do you understand why you are here?" Harrison looked different now. The past 2 weeks had visibly aged him. His once straight tie was slightly askew, and dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "Yes, Madam Chairwoman," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I am here because I failed in my duty as a judge. I failed to provide equal justice under the law." The committee members exchanged glances. They had anticipated excuses, justifications, or even denial. Instead, they found a man who seemed broken by the weight of his actions. Dr. Mitchell's full report lay before each member, and the data told a harsh story. Over the past 5 years, Harrison had imposed higher fines on minorities 73% of the time. His interruption rates, dismissive language, and harsh tone showed clear signs of bias. "Your Honor," another committee member spoke up, "can you explain these patterns in your courtroom?" Harrison looked down at his hands, then slowly raised his eyes to meet the committee. "I could try to explain them away," he said. "I could say I was just being efficient or that I treated everyone the same way, but that would be another lie, one I've been telling myself for years." A murmur spread through the crowd. In the front row, Dr. Mitchell glanced up from her notes, her expression thoughtful. "The truth is," Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength, "I didn't see my bias because I didn't want to see it. Every decision seemed reasonable at the time, but when you look at the patterns," he paused, swallowing hard. "When you look at the patterns, the truth is impossible to ignore." The committee spent hours reviewing specific cases. With each example, Harrison was forced to confront his past decisions. He watched video clips of himself speaking condescendingly to minority defendants and saw the statistics revealing how his fines disproportionately impacted communities of color. During a break, Harrison found himself standing near Dr. Mitchell in the hallway. "Dr. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, not just for that day in court, but for making you prove what people like me have been denying for years." Dr. Mitchell studied him for a moment. "Judge Harrison," she replied, "this was never about you personally. It's about a system that lets bias hide behind authority. The question is, what will you do about it now?" Back in the hearing room, Harrison addressed the committee one last time. "I request a 6-month suspension," he said, surprising everyone. "During that time, I want to work with Dr. Mitchell's office. I want to learn. I want to help other judges see what I failed to see for so long." The committee deliberated for an hour. When they returned, their decision exceeded Harrison's request. "Judge William Harrison," the chairwoman announced, "you will be suspended for 6 months without pay. During this time, you will complete comprehensive bias training, work with Dr. Mitchell's office to develop new judicial training programs, review all your cases from the past year with a civil rights attorney, and, upon your return to the bench, undergo quarterly reviews of your case patterns." Harrison nodded, accepting each requirement without protest. As he left the hearing room, reporters shouted questions, but he walked past them in silence. Dr. Mitchell watched him go, then spoke quietly to her assistant. "Schedule a meeting with the judge for next week," she said. "If he's serious about change, he's going to need support." That evening, alone in his study, Harrison opened his laptop and began typing. "Dear community," he wrote, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation, a commitment to change, and most importantly, better justice in the future." He typed late into the night, finally putting into words the hard truths he had been forced to confront. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward real justice. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the Dallas County Courthouse. On a bright Monday morning, Judge William Harrison stood before a different kind of audience, a classroom full of judges from across the state. "My name is William Harrison," he began, his voice steady and clear. "6 months ago, I was the judge who learned his lesson from Dr. Sarah Mitchell." A few people nodded, recognizing the now famous story. The classroom was part of the new Judicial Education Center established through Dr. Mitchell's reforms. Pictures of diverse judges and quotes about equal justice decorated the walls. Harrison's own story had become a key part of the training curriculum. "I'm not here to tell you I'm perfect now," Harrison continued, adjusting his familiar bow tie. "I'm here to tell you how I learned to see what I had been blind to for 20 years on the bench." In the back of the room, Dr. Mitchell sat quietly, watching her former courtroom adversary become one of her most powerful advocates for change. She smiled slightly, remembering their first real meeting after the ethics hearing. The changes in the Dallas County Courthouse were visible to everyone. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors, court clerks had completed cultural sensitivity training, and, most importantly, a new computer system tracked judicial decisions by demographics, flagging any concerning patterns. Harrison's own courtroom looked different now. He had replaced his old gavel with a new one inscribed with the words, "Listen first, judge second." A framed copy of Dr. Mitchell's original report hung on the wall, a daily reminder of where he had been and how far he had come. "The hardest part," Harrison told his fellow judges, "wasn't admitting I was wrong. It was realizing how many lives I had affected with my bias." He clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from his own court records. "These aren't just numbers. These are people who deserved better justice than I gave them." During breaks between training sessions, young new judges approached Harrison privately, sharing their own concerns about biases they were beginning to recognize in themselves. He listened patiently, just as Dr. Mitchell had listened to him during his transformation. Back in his courtroom, Harrison's changes were more than symbolic. His interruption rates had dropped dramatically. He took the time to hear each person's full story. Most surprisingly to his old colleagues, his court sessions now ran longer. Efficiency was no longer his primary concern. "Justice," he often said, "takes as long as justice takes." The elderly Black woman who had witnessed the original incident now worked as a court observer, part of a new civilian oversight program. She sat in various courtrooms, taking notes and ensuring that everyone, regardless of background, received fair treatment. Dr. Mitchell's program had expanded beyond Texas. Other states were adopting her methods, using data to track and address judicial bias. Governors and chief justices across the country regularly called her for guidance on implementing similar reforms. One afternoon, exactly 6 months after his return to the bench, Harrison presided over another traffic case. The defendant, a young Black man, was nervous about his first court appearance. "Take your time," Harrison said gently, noticing the man's anxiety. "Tell me your whole story." As the man spoke, Harrison listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and reviewed all the evidence before making his decision. In the gallery, a law student whispered to her classmate, "Is this really the same Judge Harrison from that famous video?" At day's end, Harrison sat in his chambers, reviewing his cases with a new tracking system. His phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Mitchell. "6 months. You've come a long way, Judge." He smiled, remembering how the traffic stop had changed everything. His reply was simple, "Thank you for teaching me to truly see justice." That evening, as Harrison left the courthouse, he passed a new bronze plaque by the entrance. It read, "Justice sees no color, hears every voice, and serves all equally." He paused to read it, as he did every evening. The words meant something different to him now. They were not just an ideal. They were a daily commitment, a constant challenge, and a reminder of how one moment of truth could transform not just a person, but an entire system. As he walked to his car, Harrison noticed a young lawyer hurrying up the courthouse steps, late for a hearing. "Take your time," he called out kindly. "Justice will wait for you." The lawyer smiled, surprised by the unexpected kindness from a judge. The transformation was complete, but the work would never end. And that, Harrison had learned, was exactly as it should be.